Hi, everyone. Welcome to our second session. We're just going to give a couple more seconds to let people join us. Good evening to those who are coming. We're going to start off our event this evening with a land acknowledgement. The land acknowledgement that I will be reading and referring to is about the land in Toronto. But I acknowledge that not everyone is in Toronto, and our Iranian community is big and spans all of Canada. So I'm going to put in a very interesting and important resource called nativeland.ca, and you can actually look up the land that you are situated on. So learning more about the history and the treaties of the land that you're on. All right. So we want to begin by acknowledging that we are gathering today on the traditional territory of the Wendat, the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee, the Chippewa, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations, and that Toronto is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty, signed with many Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. As we meet here today, let us renew and strengthen our commitment to reconciliation based on partnership, respect, and action to build a stronger, more resilient, and more equitable city and country. I know I'm very thankful that you are joining us here today to learn more about Indigenous rights, international Indigenous rights, with our guest, Danielle Bakari Sarvestani, who's a PhD student at the University of Kansas, right? And we're really thankful to have him here today so we can learn more about Indigenous rights. Of course, when we were organizing as the ICC's cultural committee, when we were organizing this event, the bodies of the children and the graves of the unmarked graves of the children were not yet found or not yet confirmed on at the Indian residential schools across what is now Canada. But right now we obviously know that it is of top of mind for a lot of us. And I think that the struggle for basic human rights in Canada and around the world for Indigenous nations and communities is ongoing. That is what Danielle is going to be speaking to us about today. But right now, here in Canada, there have been over 1,300 bodies of Indigenous children found within the last month at residential schools across Canada. So in British Columbia and Saskatchewan, as well as we know that there are going to be thousands more found. So we're here today to learn more, but also to know how we as an Iranian Canadian community kind of fit into this sort of narrative that we have been of Canada and what it means to us as a community. Arzu will speak a little bit more about that, the Vice President of the Iranian Canadian Congress. But I did want to touch a little bit on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was officially established in 2008, and its purpose was actually to document the lasting impacts of residential school system on Indigenous families and students and communities. And there are survivors of residential schools alive today. Many of them are pretty young. We have an MPP who in the Ontario legislature who's a survivor of residential schools. So this is not by any means a history. And we know that residential school survivors are some of the hardest impacted in our country. So they disproportionately are represented in the carceral system, in homelessness and in poverty. So we know that the lasting impacts of these. And I really want to bring this to light because right now, I think that Canada and Canadians are really struggling or dealing with how public this has all become. Many of us, including myself, someone who came to Canada at a very young age, I never actually learned very much about the residential school system. So I'm very much starting from a similar place to you, as everyone here. When I got older, I did learn a little bit more from my own personal interest and commitment to reconciliation, but this was not at all anything taught in schools. So we are kind of coming to an awakening in a country-wise, and I bring this up because tomorrow, many of us in the past would have been celebrating Canada Day, but to me, personally, I don't think it's appropriate when we have discovered the unmarked graves of thousands of children, some as young as 3 years old, because I don't think it's appropriate to be celebrating. I think this is a time of mourning, and I know tomorrow I will be mourning, and I will be reading more about the Truth and Reconciliation process, and I can put that in the chat for everyone as well. And I really do invite everyone here to join me, because we all have a role to play, or we all need to learn about the history of the land that we are on. I know we are immigrants, and we know our history in our own land, but right now I think that there needs to be we have to learn about the history of here. Without further ado, though, I do want to pass it over to Arzu Kadir, who is the Vice President of the Iranian Canadian Congress, to say a few words about sort of expanding on what I said and also bringing in about what this means for our community.
Arzu, I think you might be muted.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. So, welcome everyone. I wanted to briefly put in context, the purpose of our gathering tonight. For someone, from a personal point of view, I have lived all my life here, and I feel some form of deep trouble and pain and a bit of shame of not having been aware of what the First Nations of this land since thousands of years have suffered for us being here today. And this has been, even though I've been a responsible citizen and physician and trying to understand, but the official narrative just didn't really explain this to us, and it was on our part to find out. In the past week, the scandal of the residential school has really put this issue in bright light, and there's a lot of awareness that has been brought, collective awareness, a personal awareness of the things that we didn't know about the history of First Nations. And for now on, I invite myself and everyone to be more cautious about accepting what, as is what is told to us in the official narrative, especially when it concerns racism or any kind of violence or intervention. So up to today, the Canadian government escapes responsibility, as we heard our Prime Minister today, putting the blame on the church. As we know, the responsibility of this is equally between the government, the Crown, RCMP, and the church. And this was part of a broad political project of ethnic and cultural genocide, with complicity of all the instances of the society. This is really important to understand, because in the future they will try to sort of cover it up and close it, but we have to keep this open. It's going to take years before knowing and repairing. Because if we continue to fall in this narrative, First Nations will continue, as they have been today to this date, to have bad services, poorer health, shorter life expectancy, more polluted environment, more cancers. Women will be subject to higher rate of violence, of feminicides. Youth will suffer more addiction, violence, and suicide. The fact that indigenous peoples in 50 localities don't have access to clean water today in 2021 in one of the richest countries in the world is systematic of pure racism. As it should be very easy to respond to this basic human right necessity in one of the richest corners of the world. Racism has been a strong characteristic of the past and present political system in Canada. The Cultural Committee of ICC thinks it's important to inform in order to build solidarity between our communities, the First Nations, Iranian nations, Iranian community and other communities, to help construct a more just society for First Nations, but also against Iranophobia and Islamophobia and systemic racism that our fellow Iranian Canadian citizens might live in everyday life. Thank you. So without further ado, I pass the micro to Daniel.
Okay, thank you so much, both Sam and Arzu, for that really great presentation and introduction. Of course, as someone said, this presentation is extremely timely. It comes on the heels of recent discoveries of mass graves of Indigenous children, victims of the residential school. Of course, we had known that this was going on, that mass murder of Indigenous children were part of a systematic decision, let's say on part of the Catholic Church. But like I said before in my previous presentation, this isn't a issue that could be just put on or placed on squarely on the shoulder of one actor or one group of people, but it's a systematic issue that incorporates both government, state, the church, and institutions of the state in general. Okay, so I'm going to start my presentation. Can anybody see my presentation? Arzu, may I just get a thumbs up really quick if you can? Wonderful, thank you so much. And again, the picture you see here, it's the official slogan, "Every Child Matters," for the current movement that's going on in Canada in order to, try to hold people responsible for what happened during the residential school. And orange is our color for mourning and remembering the Native children, First Nations children who had perished as a result of discriminatory policies in the residential schools. The presentation is part of a series. This is the second part of the presentation. So if you had missed the first presentation, you can go back and watch that, the first part of the presentation, which deals a lot more with generalities, the general frameworks of Indigenous peoples' rights, and we talked a little bit about cultural differences, cultural varieties of Indigenous peoples' issues. In the second part of the presentation, we'll be dealing a lot more with specific rights that are recommended by the international community, or let's say by the United Nations, that helps promote sense of justice, provide a sense of solidarity, reconciliation in nations, in territories who have Indigenous populations or First Nations peoples. So we believe this is important for the Canadian government, for any government really, who deals with Indigenous, who works with Indigenous people, who have Indigenous peoples within their territory. And I'm going to go into detail of what it means to be Indigenous person, or how do you define an Indigenous person, which will be important if we are going to have a successful truth and reconciliation process here in Canada. Okay, so without further ado, so the two major documents that I will be talking about, and sorry, this slide is in Spanish. I guess I forgot to translate it. But anyways, I'm here presenting two major documents that I'll be talking about. Mostly revolving around Convention 169 that was passed in 1989, and the declaration of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. UNDIRP, basically. These two documents basically the framework, the international standards of Indigenous peoples' rights, and that's something that the Canadian governments around the world can always refer to in order to create policies, create laws that help facilitate access to fundamental rights for Indigenous or First Nations peoples. There are three main bodies or mechanisms within the United Nations itself that works with Indigenous peoples' rights, namely, this includes the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples Issues, the Expert Mechanism on Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous People. These three bodies or mechanisms work in conjunction with one another in order to create reports on a regular basis for each member state, and also provide recommendation on how to implement fundamental rights or implement the rights or the articles within the Indigenous Peoples' Rights discourses that I will be covering. So the underpinnings of Indigenous Peoples' rights, based in the Articles 169 and the UN Declaration, is really the notion of self-determination. The issue of self-determination is really important here for Indigenous peoples, because a lot of these communities, a lot of these societies have distinct cultural attitudes, have distinct social distinct institutions and social networks that makes them different from the, let's say, the Eurocentric or the Western or the dominant cultures within the territories that they find that they are with, that they've been, I guess, within the state that they are in. For example, in Canada, again, we know that First Nations have different religions, different customs, different practices, and the notion of self-determination really becomes important here because we want to help facilitate cultural diversity in a world that is increasingly unicultural. So we are witnessing loss of cultural diversity exactly because this issue of self-determination is not respected by international authorities, neoliberal systems, and the states themselves. So there is a shift that occurred that basically helped create the International Convention 169. And whereas previous years, there was a lot of emphasis on part of the states, like Canada, for example, on integration. And in fact, the residential schools were a product of this integrationist mentality. And the idea was that, well, we're going to integrate these communities within the dominant society. So let's say within the Canadian Western-centric culture society. And the idea is that as Indigenous people become integrated within the system, they were going to be able to benefit from the system itself, or they're going to benefit from rights and equality that was offered to every other citizen of that country. Of course, in practice, this never comes to pass. We saw, for example, in Canada, First Nations peoples, through integration, this created tremendous trauma in the communities themselves, loss of culture, loss of identity, loss of connectivity to their community, create many psychosocial problems that is beyond the focus of this presentation at the moment. But for example, we know that the loss of the community support system creates issues of anxiety, depression, even suicide. And we also witnessed that with integration, the Indigenous communities didn't become equal to the rest of society. In fact, those discriminatory practices continued under integrational policy and the integrationist policies. In fact, poverty increased among Indigenous communities. And as we're going to come to see, Indigenous people make up some of the world's poorest people in terms of GDP, in terms of income, even here in Canada. Again, under integrationist policies, Indigenous peoples were not given equal access to education, to healthcare. So all of these factors, issues combined, basically convinced the Committee of Experts to convene in 1989 to basically devise certain bodies of laws to help, recognizing the issues that Indigenous peoples face worldwide because of this integrationist mentality, colonial mentality, to devise certain set of laws to help provide to help make sure that Indigenous people can have a right to self-determination. So from 1989 onwards, the integrationist policy was seen to be obsolete. In fact, Indigenous people were not going away. They were not becoming fully integrated into societies as equal citizens. So the UN shift gears, and this is where we are seeing the developments of the ILO Convention 169. It is basically to help make sure that self-determination is guaranteed for Indigenous nations, First Nations. And as we know, self-determination is a fundamental human right, and not only for Indigenous peoples, but for any human being across the world. However, when it comes to Indigenous people, self-determination could also have a collective aspect as well. That means the collective of peoples in their culture, their society, have a right to determine their own future as they see fit. Okay, is my sound coming through? Are we okay, Arzu? Is there any questions? Can we move on from this topic? Okay. So I'm going to move on. And we're going to start with a video, basically summarizing the history of ILO Convention 169. Now, you got to understand that the ILO Convention 169 is a really powerful document because when it's integrated into the state, when state signs it, basically you ratify the convention. So this convention, it means it is enforceable by law. So when a member state joins the ILO Convention 169, they have a responsibility to incorporate these set of articles, these laws, within the framework of their national legal system, which makes it different than the declaration, because the declaration is just a simple is a sign of is a document that you sign, that you give your words to help protect, promote Indigenous peoples, right? But it's not enforceable. However, the ILO Convention, as we're going to come to find out, is enforceable under the national legal systems of member states. So we're going to watch a little a brief history of the ILO Convention, and then we're going to reconvene here in order to talk more. Okay, so can everybody see this? Let me just, okay, Arzu, can you see my screen? Yes, okay, great. Great, so I'm going to play this.
There are more than 370 million women and men all over the world who belong to an indigenous and tribal people. Their traditions and ways of life often puts them at odds with the wider population, drawing social, economic, cultural, and political lines through society. Indigenous and tribal peoples have suffered because of this in the past. Many have been forced away from their lands and territories they have traditionally occupied, leading to loss of livelihoods, culture, and identity. A number of countries have started to take steps to right these wrongs. Yet, indigenous and tribal peoples continue to be among the most disadvantaged. As a result, while only 5% of the world's population, indigenous peoples account for nearly 15% of the world's poor. Their voices and own vision of development tend to be overlooked, while they now face new threats from the impacts of climate change. Critically, indigenous women and men find it more difficult to access decent jobs due to discrimination and lack of access to quality education and training. Their traditional occupations and knowledge are frequently not recognized, despite these being fundamental tools for the fight against climate change. But if indigenous and tribal peoples continue to be left behind, the goal of ending poverty cannot be reached, and action to tackle climate change will remain incomplete. Indigenous peoples care for an estimated 22% of the Earth's surface and protect nearly 80% of remaining biodiversity on the planet. For example, a recent study in Brazil showed that deforestation in areas managed by indigenous communities with protected rights was less than 1%, compared to 7% deforestation in other areas. In 2015, through the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Agreement, the international community embarked on a historic mission to empower people, strengthen dialogue, and spur green growth for inclusive and sustainable development. To achieve this, harnessing the contributions of indigenous and tribal peoples is essential. The International Labour Organization, which hosts the only international treaty open for ratification on the rights of indigenous and tribal peoples, Ilo Convention number 169, has a new game plan to do just this. By making sure their rights are respected, their voices are heard, their livelihoods are secured, and their working conditions and social protection are improved. By ensuring that development empowers indigenous women and embraces gender equality. By closing knowledge gaps and by strengthening partnerships, bringing together governments, trade unions, employers in the private sector, civil society, the United Nations, and more importantly, indigenous and tribal peoples themselves. Investing in people and communities, striving for rights-based development, and ensuring decent work for all are fundamental for solving our global problems. Together, we...
Okay. Was everybody able to see the video? Great. Okay, thank you. Wonderful. Okay. So a couple of things here. First of all, so the video wasn't perfect either. It's really colorful and whatnot, but I mean, basically communicated some important ideas. One being that when it comes to biodiversity, loss of cultural diversity goes hand in hand with loss of biodiversity, and we see that destruction of indigenous people's ways of life, destruction of indigenous people's cultures, oftentimes goes hand in hand with destructions of the biodiversity, destructions of the environment. As you can see from the video, indigenous people occupy some of the world's most biodiverse regions. And by working with indigenous people, not only are we ensuring that indigenous cultures are provided a chance to thrive in the future, but also it will provide a chance for the community to working with indigenous communities and to help preserve environmental diversity as well as cultural diversity. Again, in the video they mentioned how indigenous people make up about 15% of the world's poor, even though they are about 5% of the world population, which is not a small number. That's about 370 million self-identifying indigenous peoples across the globe. However, the reason that the International Labour Organization is specifically involved with the cause of indigenous peoples is essentially because indigenous peoples have traditionally suffered from issues of enslavement, issues of forced labor, even lack of access to equal opportunities, and because of increasing poverty we see among indigenous nations. And this is the reason why the ILO Convention was developed in the first place, to help provide an answer to some of these pressing concerns. As I mentioned, the ILO Convention is ratifiable, which means it is the only convention that it's the only convention that deals with indigenous people's rights, and that if a country signs on to it, it becomes automatically part of the national discourse. It has to be incorporated within the nation-state legal system itself, and it could have the same power as the domestic law within member states. And as of now, to this date, I think there's about 22 countries. It might be 23, but since last 2 years, they might have changed a little bit. However, in general, there's 22 countries who have ratified the ILO Convention 169, and as you can see, most of those countries fall in Latin America. In fact, Latin America leads the world in terms of the laws that they have that help promote indigenous people's rights, indigenous people's discourses. They are at the cutting edge of indigenous people's rights discourses. What's really interesting here, you can see the continent of the Americas. You see most of Latin American countries have ratified the convention. What is missing is notably Canada and the United States. These are Anglophone or Anglophone countries of the Americas. For various reasons, they have failed to sign or ratify the convention. In the case of Canada specifically, one of the reasons that they have failed to ratify the convention is because we have here the Indian Act, and a lot of jurists would argue that the Indian Act inherently conflicts with international or Ilo Convention 169. However, again, we are trying to change this. We're trying to work with the government to help communicate to Canada why it's so important to incorporate these practices, these articles within the national discourse. And there are actively, currently, campaigns that are ongoing to try to help convince the Canadian government to become a signatory to the convention as well. Okay. Oh, and I wanted to mention briefly, so even though only the Americas have signed into the convention, you have to also recognize that there are indigenous peoples across the world. Again, there's about 370 million self-identifying indigenous persons around the world, but spread throughout at least 70 countries. There are indigenous communities across Africa, Asia, Latin America, and North America, and even Europe. We know that the 370 million is not necessarily very accurate, because actually a lot of these communities don't self-identify as indigenous person, and I'm going to explain why self-identification is really essential when it comes to implementation of indigenous people's rights. Nevertheless, yes.
No, I just wanted to say very quickly that there's a great book about the Indian Act called The 21 Things You May Not Have Known About the Indian Act, and I can.
Right.
I just wanted to share that. Yeah. So
yes,
a great resource.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you very much. Yeah, so in Canada, the Indian Act basically is the framework for how the government of Canada deals with or works with First Nations peoples. There's a lot of problem with the Indian Act that's unfortunately beyond the scope of this presentation. However, this is one of the reasons why Canada doesn't sign on to the convention, because they argue, well, we have our own Indigenous peoples' rights or First Nations laws, basically. Laws that deal with First Nations or work with that help provide a framework for Canadian government to work with First Nations peoples. Anyways, that's I'm not going to focus too much on that. However, again, like I said, we are trying to change that. We're trying to help promote ILO Convention, at least the principles within ILO Conventions, within the Canadian government, in order so that it can be implemented. At least some of those policies can be incorporated within the domestic legal system. Okay, in the context of the Americas, I think Latin America is doing a great job in pushing the envelope of Indigenous people's rights. Across Latin America, there is now a growing consensus that we are moving away from the traditional Eurocentric state system, the nation state, more from a singular nation state we're moving towards what's called a pluralistic nation-state model. In other words, in Latin America, we are now increasingly recognizing that the state is made up of multiple nationalities. So within a particular state, there could be multiple peoples, cultures, different institution systems that could coexist together in a mosaic of peoples or mosaics of nations together under a framework of the state. The same thing could be argued for Canada. Of course, Canada is home to many number of First Nations communities, cultures, peoples. It is really important for us to recognize that the state doesn't necessarily mean Anglophone or Francophone or Eurocentric state, but in the Americas, we live in a state that is extremely multinational, that there are other nationalities here in the continent of the Americas that is beyond just the simple Eurocentric Western model of the state system. Any questions about this? Someone, are we good? Excellent. So let's move on. Delving right into the Convention 169, it is really important to first define our terms. So who are Indigenous peoples, or who are First Nations peoples? There are very different definitions of who and what constitutes Indigenous. The World Bank has their own definition. Different UN organization might have their own definitions. However, one of the more increasingly accepted definition is enshrined under the ILO Convention. And according to the ILO Convention, based on Articles 1 and 2, there are basically 3 criteria. 2 of those criteria are considered objective criteria and 1 subjective criteria. In short, the objective criteria basically says objective criteria basically include people who have descent from a population who had inhabited a country or a geographical location since before or at the time of conquest, colonization, or the establishment of the present state boundaries, and that these people or these cultures retain some or all of their own social, economic, cultural, and political institution, irrespective of their status. And the subjective criteria that's really important is a notion of self-identification. So even if you have all these objective criteria, it is really important that these communities, these people self-identify as indigenous peoples. If they don't, they wouldn't fall under the definition of indigenous peoples, and they wouldn't be protected, or they wouldn't be or these rights wouldn't apply to them, essentially. And we know, for example, in many nation states across the world, a lot of these communities are afraid to self-identify as indigenous person due to years of stigmatization of what it means to be indigenous, or because of discrimination and even threats of social, political, economic discrimination. Basically, they may not self-identify as indigenous person. So like I said, the number, the 370 million peoples, could be vastly different if people were able to freely self-identify as indigenous person. This ILO convention could include more peoples, more people could be included within the definition of indigenous persons. Something to also really note really quick, the descent from a population who had inhabited a country or a geographical region since before the time of conquest. A lot of people think that this only applies to countries who have been colonized. For example, in the case of the Americas, a lot of people, they use this definition to refer to a time before the arrival of the Spaniards or the Spanish conquistadors. And that any descendants of a population who can trace their ancestry to before the arrival of the colonial authorities, these people can claim to have some kind of descendancy from indigenous peoples. However, under the definition here, they could also have the state before the establishment of the present state boundaries. So, for example, in the case of Africa, why a lot of the many nation states have refused to ratify the convention is because the argument is that, well, we're all indigenous, we're all African. There is no colonial culture societies here. We are all basically derived from our own indigenous tribes, peoples, and cultures. Therefore, we can't be considered indigenous peoples because we are African. However, under the same definition, the state boundary itself, first of all, it could be steeped in colonial practices. The state system itself could have colonial roots. And in the case of Africa and Asia, in fact, there could be a lot of communities that have been in a particular region since time immemorial, before the establishment of the state boundary, that might have divided them or resulted in the assimilation of their culture within the state system. So it doesn't necessarily refer to colonization, but it could also refer to the time where the state itself was established. Okay.
Sorry, Danielle, just a couple of questions.
Yeah, come on.
Yes, there's just a couple of questions in the chat. One person asked, why are indigenous populations subjected to so much discrimination, poverty, and violence in South America if these countries have signed the convention?
Right. So that's a really great point. So in terms of law, or at least in terms of doctrine, a lot of the legal doctrines that comes out of Latin America is actually really progressive. They are really progressive. They have these socialist ideas attached to them. However, when it comes to practice, it's completely different. We know, for example, like military dictatorships, corporations even often disregard these laws. So even though, for example, they have really wonderful constitutional legal systems, these laws just get ignored, mostly by, let's say, foreign corporations, or let's say by local actors. The states in many of these countries, first of all, they themselves don't respect the laws that they have created. Second of all, many of these countries don't have the means to help implement these policies. For example, in Bolivia, is a great example because it's one of the countries in Latin America that has the highest number of indigenous peoples. I think it's something like 70 to 80% of the state of Bolivia is made up of indigenous peoples. They have a multinational framework, so they have these concepts of local sovereignty for each particular indigenous group within different territories. However, we also see, for example, periodic coup d'etats by the military, repression that take place, and people's right to communal territories is often disrespected. So, yes, they have these laws, but it never comes to be actually implemented in their full, due to various reasons, because of politics, possibly interference from foreign states and whatnot.
Yeah, that's a great point in terms of Bolivia, because the military dictatorship eventually was overthrown, but it required a lot of organization on the ground and unfortunately a lot of deaths. Yeah, sorry. Yes, exactly. And maybe the other question might be answered later on. I'm just gonna let you continue, and we can come back to it once it's more of a discussion point.
Yeah,
I think.
Totally. One thing you have to understand here, also, guys, when we say self-determination, this doesn't necessarily mean statehood, right? Statehood is something different. State sovereignty is different than self-determination. For example, under this definition, the Bakhtiari tribe from Iran, the Qashqai tribe, perfectly could fit this definition of indigenous peoples. This means they have the right to determine their own cultural outcome. This doesn't necessarily mean that these communities have a right to secess or divide the state internally and create their own sub-states. In fact, the system, the Ilo Convention, the UNIDIRP, together, they try to prevent secessions within states. And international law generally works to maintain the integrity of the nation-state boundaries, nation-state borders. So in the spirit of the Ilo Convention, for example, in the case of Bolivia, Colombia, these countries that have signed into the convention, the ILO actually helped preserve national state systems boundaries. It helps promote state boundaries by providing avenues for indigenous cultures to help to express themselves in a way that is free of discrimination. So it provides an avenue for these cultures to be able to thrive, to be able to express themselves, to be able to have those same rights and freedoms that you and I enjoy under let's say the constitutional law or under Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Okay, does that make sense? So in fact, Iran has indigenous peoples. We for example, my great grandparents were Bakhtiari. Our culture drives from a very rich indigenous culture. It's rooted in indigenous practices. Our belief in land being sacred, again, that is something that's ingrained in in the Iranian literature. Again, these are all rooted in our indigenous ways of being. Again, Iran is a country that's rich with indigenous perspectives, indigenous practices. And I think it's important to note here as well. Okay, I'm going to move on. Am I clear so far? Is that good? Do we understand indigeneity? Okay, great, lovely. Okay, so this is basically reaffirms what I was saying earlier. Article 3 of the convention basically reiterates that this doesn't mean that these communities could secess or should secess or break up the state, make their own little nation state. In fact, it only helps promote or provide a mechanism for the states to help promote the fundamental human rights for these indigenous communities who have had the rights, let's say, trampled upon by various actors, including state actors. So it's a way to make sure that indigenous people can enjoy the same human rights that you and I enjoy, without hindrance or discrimination. Yeah. Okay. So does that make sense? Okay, so when we talk about self-determination, that's something completely different from state sovereignty. A self-determination for a community, that means they have the right to determine their own cultural outcomes, their own social outcomes within the framework of the nation state, without breaking up the nation state, essentially. Right? Does that make sense? Great, Salman. I'm gonna move on. Okay, fantastic. All right. So when it comes to responsibility, again, this goes back to how I was saying, while we have these really great laws, the problem comes to the responsibility of implementing them. Although, so for example, we have great laws inside our country, they often don't get implemented by the people who are responsible. So the responsibility based on Article 2 and Article 33 of the Convention falls squarely on the authority of the nation state. Okay, so the government itself, the national government, the ministries, they are responsible once they have ratified the convention to help incorporate these articles within the structure of the legal systems. The structure of the legal system within the nation, and also help provide mechanisms to implement these various articles and these various laws and principles. Okay, however, it has to be done with coordination and full cooperation of indigenous peoples. Okay, so the nation-state government is essentially responsible in implementing these rights, but it has to be done in a collaborative manner. Okay. So a great question that often comes up here is also related to, for example, why Latin America, there's so much violence you see against indigenous communities. It's the question of, well, who has responsibility? If, for example, the nation state is not respecting their own laws, then do private entities have a responsibility? To tell you the truth, the ILO is not really clear on this. They don't really discuss private entities here. So essentially, it says that the nation state, the government, has the full responsibility to implement these rights. However, in the cases where the government is not strong enough to help implement these rights, or the government has been compromised for any various reasons, you often see that private companies tend to infringe on these rights. So if the government can't implement them, private companies, basically private institutions, can come and do whatever they want. And then they would say, well, it's not our responsibility to help protect these rights. It's the government. And if the government is not doing anything, it's not my responsibility. So that's a very serious issue for us. For example, in the area that I've worked in Honduras, again, Honduras has ratified the convention. However, they are one of the biggest abusers of indigenous people's rights. And this is particularly because the government refuses to uphold these rights. We can see, for example, a lot of Canadian mining companies, American mining companies, they use this inaccessibility of the government, or the irresponsibility of the government, to basically exploit indigenous people's territories, exploit their natural systems without repercussion, right? And there's nobody to hold them to account. So there is a serious loophole within the ILO Convention, and it's essentially this, that the private companies are not held to account, or private entities are not held accountable. So in cases of the state being weak or unable to implement these rights, private institutions can basically do whatever they want, which is well, it goes against the spirit of the convention. I would argue that if you're a private company, even if the state doesn't uphold these rights, you have a moral responsibility to respect the laws of the nation state that you're working within. Of course, this doesn't come to pass in many of the Latin countries that we work with. Great examples of Honduras, who is currently ruled by an ultra right-wing government, and they do not respect anything considered to be communal territory, or communal rights, or indigenous people's rights. They kind of see them as socialist propaganda, for example. Okay. Right. Is there any questions about this? I know this could be a tricky topic, especially when it comes to the notion of responsibility. Who has responsibility?
I just have.
Yes?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you.
Okay, sorry. It doesn't say unmuted on my little thing. I think this is really interesting. So thank you, Danielle.
Yeah.
I just have a couple of questions. Like, I know that Canada, for instance, has a very, I would say, just has a huge mining industry. And a lot of the mining industry is in South America and in a lot of these places where, I guess so what you're saying is, like, most of the times it doesn't impact, like, the mining companies at all, like gold core and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because oftentimes these mining companies actually operate within Indigenous peoples' territories, formally recognized Indigenous peoples' territories. However, if there is no government function to help protect these rights, these land rights, for example, these mining companies basically do what they want, and essentially they shift the burden of responsibility onto the government. They say, well, it's not our responsibility to implement these. This is the government's responsibility. And if they have given us right to explore these territory and like basically exploit this territory, this is the government's responsibility, not ours. Even though the government should have protected the Indigenous people's territories, they have not. And they've given us the authority to basically exploit this land the way we want, based on our agreement with the government, right? So this happens all the time. You know, one of the major issues in Latin America is the let's say the inability of government structures to help implement their own national laws. There could be many reasons for that. One of the reasons could be liberalization or privatization process that kind of is advanced across the Americas by you know, the World Bank, IMF, and neoliberal institutions that basically undercut government organization. And without government organization or government oversight, many of these practices cannot be implemented without government infrastructure.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, and just a very quick note. It reminds me of when there was the coup d'etat in Bolivia. Chrystia Freeland and the Canadian government, like official government, the Canadian government officially did like kind of welcome it.
Yes.
And when someone had done, I read an article or report, which I'm sure you know more about this than I do, but there's a huge lithium mines in Bolivia, and they were nationalizing the lithium mines.
That's right.
And so it wasn't necessarily serving you know, like domestic corporate interests, but yeah.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. So this is often conflict, you know, the interests of indigenous nations and private entities and whatnot.
Great.
Sorry, guys. And also, anybody else, feel free to chime in here. I just have someone's picture here and my laptop on the corner. So that's the only person I see. That's why I look to her for confirmation for everything. Okay. I'm going to move on. So we're going to move on to the fundamental framework of ILO Convention. So there are essentially 6 pillars of ILO Conventions. These are general themes that the laws basically help protect. The first one, and the most importantly, you would say, is the right to consultation and participation. Again, sorry about the title. Like, this presentation was originally in Spanish, so there are parts where I haven't really translated well, or there's discrepancies in the translation. So up there it says consultation and participation. Okay, these 2 notions form the cornerstone of ILO Convention 169. It's really important because throughout history of colonization, indigenous people were never consulted with the policies of the state. In the process of state building, indigenous people were never consulted. They were never incorporated or never help given a chance to have an input. So indigenous voices are really never heard. So one of the major issues that the convention tried to tackle in Article number 6 is the issue of consultation. So this basically says that any institution, government organization, any private even entity, if they want to work within indigenous territory, they have to do so with consultation of the community. And we can go look into what does consultation mean. Okay, the convention is particularly they put a lot of emphasis in certain aspects. For example, they mention mining industry, they mention hydroelectrical industries. That these particular industries, consultation becomes even more important, because historically these industries have been most damaging towards indigenous people's territories. In the convention, it mentions specifically that the consultation has to be formal, so it can't be just one person walking into the community and just talking to a few people here and then say we've consulted the community. But it has to be part of the process, part of a formal state-funded process of engaging the community, and it has to be exercised in good faith. Under international or under Ilo Convention, good faith here means that the institutions that are trying to work within indigenous communities have to seek the correct opinion, or they have to seek the actual opinion of the community. It can't be made up, it can't be falsified documents. These would all include serious violation of good faith, right? So we see, for example, in the case of Honduras, even in Canada, the consultation process is never really taken into consideration. We saw, of course, with the case of the pipeline, where the oil industry was just building in the middle of indigenous people's territories without really consulting the various First Nation peoples that it would impact. In the case of Honduras, many of the mining industries, in order to say that they have consulted the local communities, they would go to some of these communities, maybe pay some of these leaders, one leader here, one leader over there. They would try to engage a few people and maybe forge signed document to say that we have consulted these communities. However, these were forgeries, and these do not represent formal consultation. Therefore, there's a lot of emphasis on what and how the system that is necessary to conclude a effective process of consultation that is often overlooked by government and also private entities. Again, that's why I emphasize it here. Consultation has to be undertaken through indigenous and tribal people representative institutions. Consultation has to be undertaken with the objective of reaching an agreement or consent on behalf of the indigenous communities. So the consent means vast majority of the community agree to that development project. It can't be contrary to that fact. It can't be just the opinion of, let's say, the top person or the leadership in that community, but it has to reflect the interest of the entire community as a whole, not just one or two or three people, chiefs, one chief here, the other chief there. It has to be a communal undertaking. Great. Okay. Is that understandable? I can see someone here. If you give me a thumbs up, if there's any questions or. Great. Okay. Moving on to the issue of participation, that's covered in Article 7. Basically, this suggests that any kind of development project that goes on indigenous people's territories, they have to include a system, a formal system, whereby indigenous community representative can participate in the formulation, implementation, and evaluation of plans and programs for the national regional development, which may affect the community directly. So not only in the implementation phase, but also in the formulation phase. So for example, there's a lot of programs that our government, for example, pushes on First Nations peoples. Most of these programs are not done in participation with the communities themselves. right? A lot of scientific project that goes on, you know. Even when a government body is trying to formulate a, let's say, development program intended for these communities, or a program that may affect these communities, you have to make sure that a representative body of these indigenous communities can be incorporated within the formulation phase of the project, right? And not only in the formulation phase, but during the implementation phase, and then also during the evaluation phase of any plan that may affect their community. Okay, so consultation that we care. So again, this is just referring that the reference to how important it is to include indigenous people's own representative institutions within the within any kind of project that may affect their communities or nations. Great. So participation and consultation. Any questions? So Articles 6 and 7 covered this process. Okay, Sama, so give me a thumbs up, so that means I can continue. Okay, so the second major framework of ILO Convention basically talks about social, economic, cultural, and political rights, or political institutions. Articles 4, 7, and 8 basically oblige the government to adopt special measures for safeguarding indigenous people institutions. These include cultural institutions, political institutions. Article 7 requires that indigenous people have the right to decide their own priorities. Again, Article 7 refers to the rights of participation, and also refers to the requirement of indigenous people to choose their own priorities, which is consistent with the philosophy of self-determination for indigenous people. So indigenous people have a right to determine the cultural path that they want to take. If they don't want to become incorporated as a community within the nation-state structure or within the dominant social discourse. Sorry, I have a message here, is that people are waiting in the lobby. Okay, great, excellent. Sorry, I just got distracted there. So this is consistent with the philosophy through which ILO Convention was created, and that's the right to self-determination, helping provide systems and mechanisms to make sure that these cultures survive, that these societies can thrive, is an important factor here. And these are social and cultural rights that hold governments responsible to enact policies. For example, the Truth and Reconciliation process could be one of them, right? To help provide the means through which indigenous people voices can be heard, through which indigenous people cultures can be practiced and honored, rather than destroyed and negated, right? Great. Okay. So under the cultural and social economic rights, a major component of the ILO Convention is dedicated towards land rights. Okay, and this is covered under Articles 13 to 19, generally Articles 13 to 19. So it basically suggests that land, territories, and resources are not only vital to livelihood assets of indigenous people, but also have a particular cultural and spiritual significance. We know, for example, in the case of indigenous nations, the land itself is part of the cultural formation. It's it has a spiritual significance for many of these communities. Land itself is a symbolic means, a symbolic resource through which indigenous cultures can thrive. Right, it's in a quite literal sense, it's a space it's a space within which indigenous nations, First Nations cultures can survive into the future. Right, we know, for example, through colonization, most of their lands were colonized first of all, but also expropriated, stolen, and degraded through the lumber industry, oil industry, and whatnot. However, it is essential that we help provide land rights to these communities. Okay, so one of the major aspects in the ILO Convention also deals with women's rights. We know, for example, a lot of the times, even when land rights are provided to the community, it is usually the leadership who tend to be a lot of the times men only. They tend to just kind of hold all of the territories and divide it within their own, let's say, heads of family and whatnot. This is inconsistent with the ILO Convention. In fact, the ILO Conventions in the articles advises the government to provide a system to make sure that every person, regardless of their gender and politics, is given access to that territory. Okay, and that the territory. Arazu, did you have a question? Okay, great. Right, so access to land, really important. Land has a cultural, spiritual significance for the communities, and under the ILO Convention, these lands cannot be privatized. So this is something that's quite revolutionary with the ILO Convention, because for the first time in international legal history, it puts emphasis on communal territory. Of course, in the traditional Eurocentric approach to law, land is always dispersed as a private resource. However, in the ILO Convention, it kind of flips the table. It kind of says that land is communal. It can't be bought and sold, but it belongs to the community. Okay, and as a communal resource, as a communal territory, it provides a space for cultural practices, spiritual practices, but it's a space within which all of the community should have access to, free of discrimination. So really important point here. So in the case of Honduras, where I worked for a few years, there are indigenous communities who have been allowed communal territories. Okay. However, what oftentimes happens is that those people or individuals who work on this particular land, they're provided an offer by a private community or private landowner. They say, we will buy this particular parcel from you. Okay, let's say 12, 20 acres. And they do so, and then they take it away. They say this is private territory now. So in order to avoid this problem from happening, the articles from 13 to 19 put a great deal of emphasis that this land cannot be bought or sold. This is a land specifically demarcated for the use for indigenous people and for the way they want to use it as they see fit. Okay, right. Okay. Any questions about communal territories or communal land? Arazu, I can see you. Yes. Are we good? Okay, great. Okay, so we can move on. I see a thumbs up. Okay, great. So let's move on. Okay, so the third major aspect here of the ILO Convention deals with education. Historically, indigenous people have been deprived of a education that's free of discrimination. Of course, when it comes to Canada, we had the residential school systems, which was basically a system which deprived indigenous children from access to their fundamental rights. Of course, education is a fundamental human right as well. And the ILO Convention here in Article 27, it emphasizes the right to indigenous to have equal access to education. However, there are also collective aspects within the right to education within the ILO Convention that also needs to be considered. So, for example, Article 27, it talks about how educational programs for indigenous people shall be developed and implemented in collaboration or in cooperation with indigenous communities to address its specific needs. So in other words, the educational curriculum needs to be kind of developed in collaboration with indigenous people. So it's not just enough to provide, proper school systems that everybody else uses for indigenous people, but also when it comes to the case of indigenous peoples, it's government's responsibility to incorporate cultural aspects, including histories, knowledges, technologies, value systems, languages, cultural aspiration of these communities that might be different from dominant society. And also the education system that is implemented for indigenous communities needs to be developed and executed in full participation of the community representatives. We see an aspect of that in the reservation systems in Canada. However, for example, within the reservation system, often these schools are hugely underfunded. They lack the resources, lack the infrastructure to accommodate a proper access to education for many of these Indigenous nations. The curriculum, although it incorporates certain aspects of certain cultural, social aspects that reflect the aspirations of the community, again, it's not fully complete. We definitely could work on this much more. And it's essential for the future generations and in order for these cultures to thrive in the future. Okay. Another important aspect here is the language. In a lot of these communities speak a different language. So what ends up happening, sometimes this government implement an education system that's, for example, only in Spanish, right? Well, these communities don't speak Spanish. Some of them speak Garifuna, some of them speak Miskitu, completely different languages. So it's essential to provide the linguistic mean for these students, for these kids in order to be able to thrive. Not only that, if you force an education system that's only in European languages, Spanish, English, French, you're actually helping erase traditional language systems of these communities. So it's really important to help train Indigenous teachers, Indigenous professionals, in order to be able to transmit an education system that's conducive to Indigenous people's ways of being and knowledge systems. Okay, great. Arzu, can I just get a thumbs up if we're good to go, if there's people questions? Excellent, thank you so much. So I'm going to move on. Fourth aspect of the Ilo Convention is covered under Article 8. It just basically mentioned that states shall pay due regard to Indigenous people customs and customary laws. Okay, so in cases where Indigenous people have their own customs and traditions in dealing with, let's say, offenses or criminal offenses, the government has to do its part in order to ensure that these institutions can survive. Okay, for example, many Indigenous communities, the idea of incarceration or jail system is foreign to them. The jail system is not something that's part of their culture. For example, in the case, let me see if I talk about this actually in the next section. Yes. For example, it is really important to make sure that the justice institution for these communities is preserved. Sometimes, for example, when we force justice system that's foreign to these cultures, it actually helps create more crime. It helps create more violence. So it's really important in order to help tackle issues of violence, domestic abuse, even suicide, even homicide. It's really important to consult and refer back to Indigenous people's own practices in helping provide a sense of healing for their community. Otherwise, oftentimes the European or Western-centric legal systems tend to be incompatible with these Indigenous people practices and the forms of criminal behavior that they often are subject to. Okay. Okay. Right. Again, Article 9 and 10, it basically obliges the state to respect Indigenous people customary method of dealing with offenses. However, it's really important that, there is a limit to this. As long as these customary traditions are in compliance with international fundamental human rights, it is a government responsibility to help make sure that these systems are safeguarded. An example of this could be found in Denmark, for example, or sorry, Greenland, which was colonized by Denmark. Recently, Greenland Criminal Code incorporates a lot of Inuit customary laws. They have, for example, a jail system that is more, well, first of all, they don't have a jail system. They have a system that is correctional in its practice, and it doesn't incarcerate people. So these are all examples of customary laws that are more compatible with Indigenous people's ways of being, ways of tradition and whatnot. Okay. Any questions about customary law before I go on?
I just I just have one question.
Yes.
Is there other examples that maybe we can look into about customary laws that are kind of integrated? Yeah, I would love to learn.
For example, in many First Nations communities here in Canada, they have what's called a healing circle, right? So, for example, when a person commits an offense, the entire community gathers around a circle and have the person in the middle, right, in the center, and then the community just kind of engages in a dialogue, right, and then they decide on what's the best way of providing healing. So the emphasis here is on healing rather than punishment, right? The person is seen to be a part of the community, so that the burden of responsibility is not fully placed on the individual per se, but on the community itself. So the community kind of heals as a whole. So healing circle in Canada, for example, sometimes isolation instead of jail. Sometimes the offender is told to leave the community, for a certain amount of time. Anyways, there are many different examples. Like I said, Indigenous cultures are really rich, really different, really diverse. So depending on where you look into, there are very different ways of dealing with offense that relate to the community. Just very generally, in terms of the First Nations here and Indigenous peoples across the Americas, again, there's a lot of emphasis placed on collective methods of punishment. Sorry, not collective methods of punishment, but on the collective rather than the individual. So the burden of responsibility is shifted from the individual and placed on the community. So the community has to heal as a whole rather than just the focus on the individual, right? This is why jails, a system of jails and incarceration that's common in the Western institutions tends to be incompatible with a lot of these communal cultures, these cultures that put more emphasis on community building rather than individuality. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes lots of sense. Yeah, that makes lots of sense. Sorry, I think my mic wasn't unmuted. There's one question from the audience. What is the state of political or parliamentary representation of Indigenous communities here and other countries? I know that in Canada, if someone is being, I would say it's probably in the legislature of Ontario, there's only, I think, around 1% or 2%. I think it's probably the similar numbers in the, maybe even a little bit less in the parliament. I do know that there's no minimum. So there is no minimum of you would have to be elected in like any other kind of representation here in Canada, but in other countries, Danielle, do they have like a minimum?
I believe they do. I don't know about the minimum, but in terms of representation, I know the First Nations who are comprised of, I think, if I'm not mistaken, 7 nations altogether. But the First Nations, all of them have representation in the Canadian Parliament. So they have a seat in the Canadian Parliament. That's the extent of my understanding of terms of representation. However, this amount could be much bigger. Not only that, I think given the diversity of the First Nations within themselves, again, it's not a matter of just representation on the governmental or like the federal level. It's really important to help promote a sense of self-determination in these communities. So a lot of these communities, they lack access to governmental institutions, domestic or not domestic, but let's say the governmental institutions that could help provide fundamental resources, fundamental rights to their community members. So the reservation systems are, they're notoriously, corrupt. Yes, often they lack the system, they lack the infrastructure to help provide a governing system within the reservation system. to help promote fundamental rights for Indigenous, for First Nations peoples. So there is an issue. So even though we have representation at the federal level, I think those representatives may not be reflective of the will of the First Nations peoples. Many of them are. I don't want to generalize either.
Yeah,
does that
for
answer
sure.
the question?
I think so. I just looked it up,
Okay.
by the way, and in 2015, there was 3% of the House of Commons was Indigenous, and that was 10 MPs, 10 members of Parliament. And prior to 2015, it says here that there were only 39 people, Indigenous peoples, who have served as members of Parliament prior to 2015. Just a note.
Right. Yes. There's also a problem here too. Oftentimes, the system of the nation states, or even the Canadian Parliament, is not reflective of the cultures and customs of the First Nations people themselves. So it's all the more important to be working with the First Nations community themselves in order to help build a structure or governance that is reflective of their culture, of their society, of their ways of being. For example, we know in the case of British Columbia, vast majority of British Columbia is unceded territories. So these are territories that were officially never colonized or never become part of the treaty between the British government, between the Crown and the First Nations peoples. In these territories, we need to work on a system that helps govern those communities, those unceded territories, according to Indigenous peoples' tradition and customs. So, for example, the logging companies in these territories, the oil and gas companies that exploit these territories, even though we have a representation in the Parliament, they don't help really stop the impacts of discrimination or injustice that goes on in these communities. And this, I think, is because lack of support for Indigenous people's own ways of governance, own ways of customary practices. Partially, not entirely. Right. Can we move on now, or is there still more questions? Okay. Okay, so I think we can move on. Finally, the fifth framework, or the fifth pillar of Ilo Convention, deals with cross-boundary contact or cooperation. This is dealt in Article 32. Basically, it says that governments shall take appropriate measures to facilitate contacts and cooperation between Indigenous and tribal people across borders. We know from Ilo Convention that a lot of these communities were divided. A lot of the borders of the states do not represent the natural borders of many of these Indigenous communities. In the case of Honduras or Latin Central America, the Maya Chortis, for example, are divided between Guatemala and Honduras because of that state boundary. And this division of these peoples makes it really difficult for cultural continuity, for any kind of activities across boundaries. So, for example, some of the relatives could be on one side of the border, other relatives would be on the other side of the border. So it's government's responsibility to help promote programs and method in order to help facilitate this cultural continuity across border regions. This could be relative to many nomadic indigenous tribes. For example, across Africa, there's the Maasai people who were divided between multiple different states. When the state was formed, they never really took the indigenous people into consideration, so that these communities could be divided between families even across borders. And because of the border restrictions, all of a sudden this represents a huge interference in their cultural practices, in their traditional way of life. In the US and Canada, I know First Nations peoples have a special path through which they can cross the barrier or cross the boundaries, state boundaries, without harassment. Although this isn't often practiced. We know harassment of Indigenous nations as they try to cross borders for various cultural or spiritual practices. is a thing in the US and Canada. However, we have those laws in Canada that help promote cross-boundary access for First Nations peoples, right? Okay, great. Is there any questions about this? Excellent, thank you. So I see thumbs up, lovely. Okay, so in general, these 5 pillars kind of enshrine what Ilo Convention kind of covers. Again, we went through the articles in a kind of broad category. However, taken together, these 5 content are really essential for any state who is trying to implement an effective peace and reconciliation or truth and reconciliation process. And I think it could be an important set of factors for any government organization to consider when they working with Indigenous communities. I can say a word about the United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous People. The focus of this presentation was mostly on the ILO Convention, and this is simply because the ILO Convention is enforceable, whereas the UNIDIRP Declaration is not enforceable. It was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 2007. There were 143 votes in favor of this article, of this declaration, and it's interesting. Let me just move this. Right, and it's interesting, there was only 4 negative votes against it, and surprise, surprise, those 4 negative votes consisted of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States, and 7 abstention. However, the vast majority of the General UN Assembly voted in favor of the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in 2007, and it was overwhelmingly passed by the General Assembly. The only difference, I think, the big difference here, that the declaration is not really enforceable. So even though nation states could have signed onto the declaration, it doesn't mean that they are responsible to incorporate the articles of the declaration. The major, I guess, contentious point here that makes it very different, even than the ILO Convention, is the notion of self-determination, right? In the ILO Convention, even though it is based on the philosophy of self-determination, it never really refers to self-determination in any of the articles itself, right? And this was because the member states are really concerned with the idea of secession. So the idea is that if we give Indigenous nations verbatim the right to self-determination, this might be taken as a right to statehood, right to state sovereignty, and may promote the dissolution or the division of the state. So it was intentionally kept out of the ILO Convention. However, in the declaration, the issue of self-determination is mentioned in Articles 3, 4, and 26, verbatim, right? And it says that these people have a right to land, communal territories, and within these land, they have a right to self-determination. Again, in the UN Declaration, self-determination does not really refer to division of the state or the disillusionment of the state. It really refers to the right for a community who is culturally different than a dominant culture or society to have a right in order to choose their outcome, their cultural, social, political outcome within the framework of this state. Okay. Yeah, I talk about self-right determination, which is compatible with the ICCPR and ICCSR, which are, I don't think we can delve into this in a different presentation. However, I'm not going into that. And I'm going to just end the presentation here. Thank you, Wakla Wala, which is a Mayan, thank you for participating. This is a ceiba tree. Again, it reflects the cultural roots that Indigenous people have. Right, Indigenous cultures have thousands of years, developed their culture that's really reflected of the natural territories that they belong to. And so it's really important that, in the age when we're dealing with climate crisis, climate change, and environmental degradation, that we work with cultures that have helped thrive, that have helped take care, that have helped defend against, or what's the word I'm looking for? Help promote cultural environmental diversity, cultures that are so in sync with the environment that they're in, you know, through traditional wisdom, traditional knowledge, that we work with these cultures and incorporate their ways of being into our own daily practices in order to not only love and you know, have this deeper connection with the land that we're in, that we reside on, but also to help defend against you know, any kind of injustice, degradation that might be brought onto this land. Again, these cultures place a lot of importance on the land itself and the importance of taking care of it. And with that, I would like to invite everybody, if you're in Toronto, to join us on Thursday, July 1st. This is Canada Day for a march, essentially, for missing and murdered women, but also for the children that were murdered through the residential school system. We are going to be meeting at, I guess, maybe I have someone to share this with everybody, but at 439 Dundas Street, and we're going to be marching on 10 a.m. and gathering at the Spirit Garden Center at 12 at noon. So I invite everybody to be part of the change, to be part of the change that will be that's necessary in order, if we're going to survive as a culture, as a people in the future. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Danielle. This was so informative to me, and I know so many other people. And thank you for sharing this march that is happening tomorrow, and also sharing your insights and your knowledge. Like Danielle said, this conversation and being a part of the change is ongoing. And I know. So a lot of us are immigrants to Canada, and many of the forces that kind of pushed us out of our home country, which is imperialism, colonialism, capitalism, are the same kind of forces that Indigenous people here have to deal with today. And so I see that there's a lot of points of intersection and solidarity that we can build between Iranians and Indigenous peoples in Canada and across the world, around the world. And we know that as we move forward, that this kind of wave that we've been living is a little bit, not a little bit, but very unsustainable. If you are in British Columbia right now, you are dealing with some of the hottest of days. And that is by no means an accident. That is because people in power have been, prioritizing their bottom line, the profit over the health of our communities. And this is only going to get worse if we don't, come together and demand better. And one thing that's very clear in Canada, it has to do with Indigenous nations and sovereignty in communities, especially in terms of land back and making sure that Indigenous people have access to have access to the land, to take care of the land, and also making sure we're not investing in oil. That's my personal opinion. We don't need to be doing that in Canada. And buying pipelines that also buying pipelines that impede on Indigenous sovereignty. So I see this as a way that we can move forward together, and that's something that the Culture Committee wants to be doing. We're dedicated to providing different avenues for our community members to express themselves, but also to invite all of us to learn more about what it means to be Iranian Canadians here as settlers onto Canada, and what does it mean to build solidarity with other folks. So with Indigenous peoples, but also Indigenous people across the world, and also, of course, Indigenous peoples in Iran. I'm just going to pass this over also to Arzu now, so she can mention the art project Sorry, yeah, Danielle, do you want to say something?
No, thank you. That was wonderful. I appreciate the space. And, yeah.
Yeah, and if anyone has any questions or maybe wants to learn more, and you can always reach out to ICC. Maybe we can think about other ways we can incorporate this kind of more learning. I'm just gonna, pass it over to Arzu.
Well, I think you gave the final comments that were very good, Samanjan. I don't have anything to add. You wanted me to add something?
No, I just thought maybe if you wanted to mention something about Art Project for 1400, if you want to.
Okay, so Art Project 1400 is a project around healing. So it's a bit like we feel it like a healing circle, like with art in our community. In this COVID year, 1400 refers to the year began in March in Iran, the new century, and so it will be. It's a continuation of projects that is aimed to building resilience in these times of hardship, economic hardship, health difficulties. And our next project is an exposition of visual arts. And it's going to be from Iranian artists here and in Iran that have gracefully offered to participate. And we will be sending this with often comments on how art has helped them or inspired them during this time or in other difficult times of their life. Because as we know, art has always been a way of communicating our deepest sensations or feelings or conditions, so as a human being. So this exposition will start tomorrow and will be going on through the next month and a half. And we expect your feedback in every sense. And we will continue the project and are working on a project that will also be linking the indigenous cultures of here and in Iran in some form of way. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank
you all for joining us tonight. I encourage everyone who's in Toronto to go to the march tomorrow, but also if you don't want to go to the march, that's okay. But try to reflect on the life that was lost and how we can move together, forward together. All right, have a great night. Yeah.
I will be there. Come say hi. I'll be at the march. So if you see me, come say hi.
Yeah. That's great. Wonderful. Okay. I hope that everyone has a great evening. Take care.